In the shadowed underbelly of the Cold War, beneath the public image of Soviet strength and ideological certainty, there existed a category of soldiers so secret, so extreme in purpose, that even many within the Red Army had never heard of them. Units designed not to win battles, not to hold territory, not even to return home, but to die in the opening hours of World War III, carrying out missions so suicidal that their survival was not considered, not planned for, and not even discussed in training. These were the Soviet suicide brigades, a Western nickname given decades after their existence was revealed. But inside the USSR, they were known simply as GRU Spetsnaz, special groups whose real objective was to penetrate deep into NATO territory, cripple command infrastructure, assassinate key political leaders, sabotage nuclear systems, and unleash chaos behind enemy lines, knowing full well that their mission would end with their annihilation. Their origins traced back to the ideological paranoia of the late 1940s, when Stalin and his senior general staff believed that if war erupted with the West, the first hours would decide everything, and therefore, elite teams would have to infiltrate Europe before the war even began, hiding in safe houses, blending into Western cities, waiting years, sometimes decades, for a single coded phrase that would activate them and send them on missions with a 0% survival rate. Recruited from the most psychologically resilient, physically gifted, and politically loyal young men the Soviet Union could produce. These operatives were trained not only to fight, but to disappear into foreign societies, to adopt Western clothing, accents, and habits, to build new identities with the knowledge that once deployed, they would never see their homeland or families again. Many were told, bluntly, that they had already died in the eyes of the state, their official records erased, their families informed that they had transferred to classified duty from which correspondence was prohibited. Their missions were drawn from a chilling strategic logic. The Soviet General Staff anticipated that NATO's technological edge, especially in communications, satellite reconnaissance, and nuclear delivery systems, would allow Western forces to cripple the USSR early unless their own infrastructure was heavily disrupted. Therefore, Soviet planners created these special units to be activated only when Moscow believed war was unavoidable, giving them objectives such as destroying fuel depots, assassinating NATO generals, sabotaging early warning radar arrays, killing communications officers, mining roads near capitals, cutting undersea cables, poisoning water supplies on isolated military bases, or storming hardened bunkers with plastic explosives strapped directly to their chests. Survivability was not part of the design. Expendability was. Many Western analysts would later compare them to Japanese kamikaze units, but the comparison was imperfect. Kamikazes died in the act of striking. Soviet suicide brigades were meant to die after days or weeks of fighting, hunted down by NATO forces behind enemy lines, trapped between collapsing infrastructure and the chaos of a continent at war. Their existence was never acknowledged publicly, but fragments of their training program would leak through defectors, declassified files, and the testimonies of retired GRU officers after the fall of the Soviet Union. One of the most chilling accounts came from a former instructor who described the first day of training. Recruits were taken to a windowless bunker, handed a small blank notebook, and told, "Write down the names of all the people you love. This will be the last time you are allowed to love them." Instructors then burned the notebooks in front of them and announced that emotional attachments were incompatible with their mission. From that day forward, recruits would be considered property of the motherland. Their training was extreme, even by Spetsnaz standards. underwater demolitions in freezing rivers, months of hand-to-hand combat drills designed to kill silently within seconds, foreign language immersion using recordings smuggled from the West, survival courses in remote Siberian forests where recruits were forbidden to kill animals for food and instead required to build traps, eat insects, and scavenge like stray dogs. Psychological conditioning was equally brutal. Sleep deprivation, stress inoculation, and staged betrayals were used to harden them against interrogation. In some cases, instructors even simulated the death of teammates to teach recruits not to hesitate when abandonment became necessary. Recruitment into these brigades was not voluntary. Soldiers were handpicked from elite airborne, naval Spetsnaz, or reconnaissance units after rigorous observation. Those selected were briefed only that they were entering deep penetration units, with the true suicidal nature of their missions revealed only later. One defector claimed that when he learned the full truth, he attempted to resign, only to be threatened with charges of treason. Once accepted, operatives were trained to blend seamlessly into Western society. They learned how to shop in supermarkets, how to order in restaurants, how to behave on public transportation, how to read foreign newspapers, and how to mimic Western fashion and hairstyles. Photographs of European cities were pinned to training compound walls, and recruits practiced walking, breathing, and speaking like Western civilians. They were taught local slang, idioms, and even private jokes common among West German or British youth, because small mistakes could expose them during infiltration. Advanced units were smuggled into Western Europe through diplomatic channels, cargo shipments, forged passports, and in some rare cases, via submarine landings on remote coastal shores. Once inserted, they established long-term sleeper identities, renting apartments under fake names, taking mundane jobs, and blending into the background as they quietly scouted NATO installations, marked escape routes, identified political figures' routines, and stockpiled weapons in hidden caches buried in forests or disguised within basements and abandoned factories. Some sleeper operatives lived in the West for years, waiting for a coded phrase to arrive through a shortwave radio broadcast, a phrase that would mean the Soviet Union believed World War III had begun, and their final mission was now active. Their training manuals made it clear, once activated, they were not expected to return, not expected to surrender, not expected to be rescued. They would sabotage until killed. Many mission scenarios assumed a nuclear exchange had already begun. Clouds of radioactive dust sweeping across Europe, NATO leadership evacuating into bunkers, communications networks breaking down, and chaos consuming civilian populations. In this apocalyptic environment, Soviet suicide brigades were expected to emerge from hiding and strike at whatever remained of NATO's command structure. Some missions were so extreme that even their instructors doubted their feasibility. One plan involved storming NATO bunkers in Belgium, using only suppressed pistols and explosives. Another required operatives to attack U.S. nuclear bases in Germany during wartime conditions, using stolen uniforms to bypass security. Perhaps the most disturbing missions involved political assassinations. Declassified files revealed that suicide brigades were assigned kill lists targeting dozens of high-ranking NATO officers, key politicians, and major industrial figures whose elimination was deemed strategically demoralizing. These operatives, once activated, would not behave like typical commandos. They would behave like ghosts with no fear of death, driven by ideological conditioning and the knowledge that returning home was impossible. Western counterintelligence agencies, MI6, the CIA, and West German BND knew fragments of their existence, but underestimated their scale and capabilities. It was only after the fall of the Soviet Union that the full scope of these one-way units became clearer. Retired GRU officers described entire branches of special forces built around missions with no exit strategy. Some spoke of training exercises so dangerous that fatalities were common and rarely reported to families. Others revealed that operatives were sometimes instructed to live like ordinary citizens in Hamburg, Frankfurt, or Munich, working quiet factory jobs by day and practicing explosives assembly in their basements at night, all the while waiting for a war that never came. And yet, despite their secrecy, their impossible missions, and their grim purpose, these men believed they were preventing war rather than causing it. They were taught that their willingness to die would deter NATO, aggression, that their hidden presence behind enemy lines would force the West to think twice before launching a first strike, that their existence acted as a shadow, an invisible knife that kept NATO commanders awake at night. But the truth was far more tragic. They were weapons the Soviet state was prepared to expend instantly, lives erased the moment they received their activation order. To their instructors, they were not soldiers, but tools, sharpened, hardened, and ultimately disposable. Their story is one of secrecy, brutality, and human sacrifice on a scale few Cold War histories ever acknowledge. And the deeper you dig into their world, the darker and more unsettling it becomes. The deeper one goes into the internal structure of these Soviet one-way Spetsnaz units, the clearer it becomes that they were not simply combat troops sent on difficult missions. They were weapons engineered with chilling precision, sculpted by the state through psychological conditioning, ideological indoctrination, and training environments so extreme that they blurred the lines between preparation and punishment. Their leadership understood that the success of the suicide brigades depended on an unbreakable mental state, a belief that death was not an unfortunate possibility, but an expected conclusion, and so instructors spent years constructing a mindset in which self-preservation was treated as a weakness, and sacrifice was taught as the highest form of patriotism. Recruits were subjected to relentless tests designed to fragment their old identities and fuse them into instruments of the motherland. In one documented training course described by a GRU defector, recruits were blindfolded, transported into the Siberian wilderness, and left with no supplies except a knife and a compass. They were told that their instructors would hunt them for the next 72 hours, and that capture meant failure and punishment. Many nearly froze, some broke bones during nighttime escapes, and a few disappeared entirely. The objective was not survival, it was obedience. Instructors wanted to see which candidates kept moving, even when injuries made every step agonizing, who resisted panic when stalked by armed men, who continued forward even after realizing they could not win. Those who slowed down or hesitated were immediately expelled from the program or reassigned to lesser units. The reasoning was simple. If they could not run toward death when commanded, they could not be trusted behind NATO lines. Inside training compounds, language instructors drilled operatives in the accents of West German teenagers, British working-class laborers, French delivery drivers, and American military dependents. They memorized street layouts of Western cities from grainy photographs and outdated maps. They were forced to watch hours of Western television, sitcoms, news broadcasts, commercials, not for entertainment, but to mimic cultural behavior. In one now famous exercise, recruits were given a simulated Western grocery store filled with unfamiliar products, prices, and packaging, and told to shop as naturally as possible while being graded on whether they looked confused, hesitant, or out of place. Failure resulted in extra drills or punishment runs. Their instructors understood that one wrong movement, a pause too long, a mispronounced word, an incorrect currency exchange, could betray their identities when the time came to operate behind enemy lines. But perhaps the darkest element of their preparation came from what Soviet planners called terminal phase conditioning, a method designed to remove any fear of death. Instead of teaching recruits to survive, instructors trained them to psychologically detach from survival entirely. They were shown recordings of nuclear blast footage, photographs of chemical weapon victims, and diagrams of NATO bunker layouts with red circles marking the places where they would be expected to place explosives, even if doing so guaranteed their own deaths. Some recruits were even required to rehearse the final seconds of their mission, running headfirst into a mock bunker entrance, detonating a dummy charge on their chests, and falling to the ground as if killed. Reports suggest that instructors evaluated how convincingly they simulated their own death, rewarding recruits who showed no hesitation, no flinch, no moment of self-preservation. Missions assigned to these operatives were divided into multiple categories, each tailored to different phases of a NATO-Warsaw Pact war. First were the pre-strike sabotage units, whose role was to disable NATO's ability to mobilize in the hours leading up to open conflict. These missions included cutting fiber optic cables, blowing up transformer stations, disabling fuel depots, and assassinating key communications officers who would otherwise direct air and ground responses. These tasks required stealth, patience, and a willingness to kill without hesitation, but they still allowed for the possibility of temporary cover or escape. Then came the initial strike brigades, activated the moment Soviets believed NATO was preparing for a nuclear or large-scale conventional strike. These units had a near 0% survival expectation, even in planning documents. Their objectives included storming radar installations, laying shaped charges in underground command bunkers, sabotaging early warning sensors, and attacking NATO's nuclear storage sites in Germany and Belgium. The mission was not to survive. It was to blind NATO, disrupt communications, and delay retaliation long enough for the USSR to launch its first wave of missiles. According to declassified NATO counterintelligence files, these units were believed to be among the most dangerous elements of the Soviet Special Forces machine because they operated with absolute disregard for their own lives, making them nearly impossible to intimidate or deter. Next were the post-strike chaos teams, sometimes called resurrection units by NATO analysts. These groups were expected to activate only after a nuclear exchange had occurred, emerging in the ruins of Western cities to strike what remained of command structures. Their missions included killing surviving political leaders, assassinating military officers fleeing to emergency shelters, taking out small pockets of NATO resistance, and ensuring that Western countries could not re-establish coordinated military responses. In some Soviet planning documents, these units were even expected to seize control of civilian broadcasting stations and deliver scripted propaganda messages announcing Soviet superiority, fully aware that radiation levels and NATO counterattacks meant they would die shortly afterward. The final category was perhaps the most disturbing: deep sleepers, operatives deployed into the West years or even decades before war was expected. Their role was to live as Western civilians, start families if necessary, and establish identities so deeply woven into society that NATO would never suspect them. They were placed near military bases, power stations, ports, and major industrial centers. Many worked ordinary jobs, mechanics, factory laborers, shopkeepers, while quietly monitoring military routines. Their activation phrase would be delivered through coded shortwave broadcasts, often disguised as weather forecasts or agricultural reports. Some deep sleepers reportedly lost touch with Moscow over time, but continued living in place, their original missions still a dormant shadow inside their minds. The psychological toll of this life was enormous. One defector told Western intelligence that his greatest fear was not being caught. It was waking up every morning unsure if the Soviet Union still existed or if he had been abandoned by the country he was trained to die for. Soviet planners justified these brutal missions by arguing that NATO had similar units, though no Western equivalent matched the scale or suicidal nature of the Soviet brigades. The USSR's doctrine was rooted in a belief that war with the West would be existential and total, a conflict in which all sacrifice was necessary. To Soviet strategists, these operatives represented a final, terrible power, the ability to continue fighting even if the nation itself was dying. NATO intelligence agencies only began to understand the full scope of these units in the 1980s, after a series of arrests revealed caches of Soviet explosives hidden across West Germany. Some were found in forests, others in abandoned barns, and a few in drainage tunnels running beneath autobahns. One discovery included silenced pistols, forged documents, maps of military bases, and explosives wrapped in vacuum-sealed weather-resistant bags. These discoveries sent shockwaves through European governments, which realized that Soviet sabotage teams had been preparing for war inside their borders for decades. After the fall of the Soviet Union, retired GRU officers gave interviews describing their roles in training these operatives. One officer recalled telling a recruit, "Your oath is not to survive for the motherland. Your oath is to die for her." Another described watching trainees practice smiling in the mirror, not because they needed to appear friendly, but because Soviet men rarely smiled like Western men did, and a lack of natural smiling could expose them. Even more chilling were accounts of instructors reminding operatives that their families could never know who they had become. They were expected to simply vanish into the West whenever orders came. Some recruits wrote farewell letters they were forbidden to send, sealing them in envelopes that were later burned by officers. While most never deployed in real conflict, their existence cast a long shadow over NATO strategy. Their presence meant that every major war plan had to account for invisible enemies scattered across the continent, enemies who needed no extraction route, no supply line, no backup, only a target. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, many expected these operatives to return home or reveal themselves. But in many cases, they did not. Some disappeared permanently. Some cut ties with Moscow and tried to live quietly in the West. And some returned only to find that their records had been erased so thoroughly that the new Russian government barely believed they existed. What remained was a troubling legacy. Tens of thousands of pages of Soviet planning documents, maps marked with infiltration routes, and testimony from survivors revealing the Cold War's darkest truth: that the world had been far closer to clandestine sabotage, deadly infiltrations, and suicidal special operations than the public ever knew. And even today, intelligence analysts quietly admit that buried beneath European soil or hidden inside forgotten bunkers, there may still be caches of Soviet explosives and equipment waiting for a war that never came. Remnants of a strategy built around the willingness of men to die anonymously in a foreign land. The suicide brigades were not merely units. They were a doctrine of sacrifice, a weaponized ideology that treated human lives as expendable cartridges in the machinery of global war. Their story is a testament to the terrifying lengths superpowers were willing to go to in the name of victory, and to the invisible armies trained to die in silence so their nation could claim survival. As the Cold War entered its later decades, the Soviet suicide brigades evolved into something even more complex and dangerous. A hybrid force combining traditional sabotage, political assassination, psychological warfare, and nuclear-era contingency planning, all tied to a doctrine that assumed Europe would become a burning wasteland within hours of conflict. Their missions expanded beyond explosives and covert infiltration, venturing into realms that blurred the lines between espionage and terror. Soviet planners recognized that NATO's greatest strength was not just its military technology, but the interconnected social stability of Western democracies, communications networks, civilian morale, political legitimacy, and they sought to weaponize chaos itself. The suicide brigades, already conditioned to operate without hope of rescue, were seen as ideal instruments for this form of warfare. In addition to their military targets, they were instructed to exploit psychological fracture points, a term used in internal GRU documents, referring to places where the shock value of violence could create panic far beyond the physical damage inflicted. These included symbolic locations such as crowded train stations, major bridges, financial centers, and public transportation hubs. The goal was not random terror, but calculated chaos. Strikes designed to paralyze Western society during the critical first hours of war, forcing governments to divert resources away from military response and toward civilian protection. Many of these plans remained theoretical, but some were disturbingly detailed, including diagrams for planting explosives near structural weak points of the Rhine River bridges, and instructions for contaminating water reservoirs located near NATO air bases. Another layer of complexity emerged through what Soviet strategists called decapitation corridors, pre-planned routes across Western Europe that laid out how a suicide brigade, operating in teams of 2 or 3, could reach government bunkers in Belgium, West Germany, or France. These routes included abandoned mines, storm drainage systems, forgotten smuggling tunnels from World War II, rural tractor roads, and concealed forest paths known only to local hunters. Soviet operatives memorized these paths using photos and detailed terrain models. Inside the USSR, instructors built mock-ups of these routes using dirt, wooden beams, and improvised tunnels, forcing recruits to crawl, run, fight, and hide through them for hours without rest. They were trained to move through territory as if already behind enemy lines, meaning every sound had consequences, every step was a potential reveal. The psychological pressure of this training was immense. Recruits lived with the constant fear of simulated NATO patrols capturing them, and though these were training exercises, instructors held real authority to physically punish or expel those who made mistakes. Many recruits described these exercises as living inside your own future death, because at every turn they were reminded that once deployed, there would be no extraction team, no air support, no reinforcements, and no chance of returning home alive. As Western intelligence agencies began piecing together evidence of these units, countermeasures were designed to anticipate Soviet infiltration strategies. MI6 established specialized surveillance teams near major embassies, airports, and ports, while West Germany's BND created an entire division dedicated to tracking unexplained movements near rural military zones. NATO also deployed advanced seismic sensors around key installations to detect underground tunneling or covert movement. But these efforts could not fully counter the depth of Soviet planning. Sleeper agents had been planted decades earlier, some as early as the 1950s, meaning many were already deeply rooted in Western society by the time NATO realized the extent of the threat. Some lived under multiple identities, using forged passports, stolen birth certificates, or fabricated documents created by Department 12 of the KGB, a division specializing in psychological operations and identity manipulation. In a few extreme cases, sleeper operatives married local citizens, had children, and created families unaware that the father or mother was a trained suicide operative waiting for Moscow's call. These individuals lived silently, blending perfectly into suburban life, going to PTA meetings, mowing lawns, attending church, and watching Western television shows, all while a hidden identity and mission lay dormant beneath the surface. One defector described meeting an operative who had lived in England for 12 years, running a small bakery while maintaining a hidden cache of explosives beneath the shop floor. He was more British than the British, the defector recalled, yet he never forgot the signal phrase that would activate him. This dual existence created enormous psychological strain. Some operatives developed conflicting loyalties, not to NATO, but to the families, neighbors, and communities they lived among. GRU leadership attempted to counter this by routinely rotating operatives back to Eastern Europe for renewal cycles, short periods in which their ideological conditioning was reinforced and personal connections were intentionally disrupted. During these renewal cycles, operatives were reminded that attachment to the West was a betrayal of the motherland and that their mission was sacred, tied to the survival of socialism itself. If an operative expressed doubts, instructors used harsh methods to reassert control, including isolation, re-indoctrination classes, harsh physical punishment, or, in extreme cases, reassignment to penal units. Despite the secrecy of these operations, cracks began to show as the Soviet Union entered the late 1980s. Morale among some suicide brigades eroded due to deteriorating economic conditions at home. News of corruption within the Communist Party undermined the ideological certainty recruits had been taught to worship. Some suicide operatives began to question whether they were truly serving a just cause or merely sacrificing themselves for a system that no longer believed in its own propaganda. These doubts, while not widespread, were enough to concern senior GRU leadership. Reports circulated of operatives failing psychological tests, asking forbidden questions, or even attempting to defect. One operative, stationed undercover in West Germany, disappeared entirely after contacting a Western intelligence service. His disappearance caused massive internal panic, as Soviet leadership feared he would reveal not only the existence of the suicide brigades, but also active safe houses and sleeper cells. Soviet agents searched desperately for him, but he was never found. Some analysts believe he was quietly relocated to the United States under a new identity. Others believe he was eliminated by the KGB before reaching Western authorities. As the USSR weakened, NATO intelligence gained increasing insight into these units. In 1990, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, several West German police units discovered Soviet weapons caches buried beneath forests and farmland. Caches stockpiled with explosives, ammunition, forged documents, and coded notebooks containing instructions for wartime sabotage. Many were so well hidden that local residents had walked over them for decades, unaware of the deadly arsenals beneath their feet. Each discovery raised new questions. How many other caches existed? How many operatives had vanished into Western society? How many missions remained active even after the USSR collapsed? The suicide brigades were designed to operate independently if Moscow was destroyed, meaning that a nuclear war or the collapse of Central Command would not automatically deactivate them. They were essentially self-contained weapons, set to trigger only when specific radio codes were broadcast. With the dissolution of the Soviet Union, some of these codes were lost, others were forgotten, and a few may still exist in old KGB archives that have never been fully declassified. Historians today believe that some suicide operatives continued living in the West after 1991, too deeply embedded to return home and too unsupported to complete their missions. Their identities remained hidden, their purpose extinguished, their pasts erased. Some may have died quietly, their families unaware of their true origins. Others may still be alive, elderly men living in small towns in Germany, France, or the United States, carrying secrets they were never meant to take to the grave. Meanwhile, Russia, emerging from the chaos of the 1990s, reassessed its special operations doctrine. While modern Spetsnaz no longer trained suicide brigades in the same manner, elements of the doctrine survived in modified form. Deep infiltration units still exist, though with far more emphasis on survivability and extraction. Some modern Russian operatives are trained to sabotage NATO infrastructure during wartime, but their missions include escape plans and fallback routes, unlike the suicidal missions of the Cold War era. Nevertheless, the legacy of these brigades continues to shape Russian military thinking, particularly in areas of hybrid warfare, cyber sabotage, and psychological operations. And in NATO countries, the fear of hidden operatives left behind from the Soviet era still lingers in intelligence circles. Unexplained deaths, mysterious fires near military bases, or sudden sabotage attempts occasionally revive old suspicions. Analysts quietly ask, did all the suicide operatives vanish? Did every weapons cache get found? Did every sleeper agent truly abandon their mission? The unsettling truth is that no one knows for certain. The suicide brigades remain one of the darkest chapters of Soviet military strategy, a chilling blend of human devotion and state manipulation. They were soldiers trained to die without glory, without recognition, without even the hope of returning home. Their existence reveals the terrifying extremes the superpowers were willing to embrace during the Cold War, sacrificing not just resources or political capital, but human lives molded into disposable instruments of war. And their story is a reminder that beneath the diplomatic negotiations, the nuclear treaties, and the political speeches, there were hidden armies in the shadows, men whose identities were erased, whose futures were predetermined, and whose final breaths were meant to be taken behind enemy lines, alone, silent, and forgotten. The legacy they left behind is not one of victories or medals, but of invisible scars on the landscape of Europe, silent warnings of what states will do when consumed by fear, ideology, and the belief that only death can guarantee security. In the aftermath of the Soviet Union's collapse, as the new Russian Federation struggled through economic disaster, civil unrest, and political reshaping, the fate of the suicide brigades became one of the Cold War's most unsettling mysteries, not because the units were exposed in their entirety, but because they were not. The fall of the USSR triggered a chaotic scramble among intelligence agencies worldwide, each attempting to seize or copy whatever fragments of KGB and GRU archives they could before documents were burned, stolen, or sold on the black market by desperate officials. What emerged from this frenzy was shocking but incomplete. Scattered training logs, mission briefings devoid of names, maps leading to buried caches, and references to independent operational cells, whose locations had been lost even to Moscow. Western analysts were stunned to discover how deeply the Soviet strategy had relied on these operatives, not as marginal saboteurs, but as critical cogs in a wartime machine designed to outlast nuclear Armageddon itself. Yet the most important information, the identities, locations, activation codes, and personal files of the operatives, remained mostly missing, destroyed during the USSR's collapse, or locked away in undisclosed Russian archives. This absence of closure created decades of paranoid whispers in NATO intelligence circles. MI6, CIA, and BND analysts speculated that dozens, perhaps hundreds, of Soviet operatives had lived unnoticed in European cities, too entangled in their constructed Western lives to extricate themselves, too unsupported by Moscow to return home, and too dangerous for Western agencies to identify without concrete evidence. Some retired NATO officers believe that a handful of these operatives died quietly in foreign countries under their false identities, taking to the grave the knowledge that they had been weapons whose activation never came. In Russia, the legacy of the suicide brigades became even more complicated. During the 1990s, when the state was too weak to maintain strict military secrecy, a few former GRU officers attempted to publish memoirs describing their experiences training the one-way operatives. Most were censored or quietly pressured into silence by the emerging security apparatus, now reconstituting itself around continuity with Soviet-era institutions. One manuscript, smuggled to the West and partially translated, described the grim lives of operatives who had returned from the West after years under cover, only to discover that the state no longer had a place for them. Their skills were obsolete, their records classified, and their identities permanently severed from the world they had left behind. Many became alcoholics, some became criminals, and others disappeared entirely, unable to reconcile the life they were trained to die for with the chaotic new Russia they returned to. Those who remained loyal to the new government often became instructors in modern Spetsnaz academies, passing on modified fragments of their training to new generations of operatives, though never to the suicidal extremes of the Cold War. But the past never vanished completely. Occasionally, Russian media would report on strange discoveries. An abandoned cache of Soviet explosives found in a forest. A rusted container filled with outdated identity documents discovered beneath a farmhouse. An old notebook filled with coded radio frequencies uncovered during renovations in an apartment once occupied by a mysterious foreign renter. Each discovery reignited speculation about the operatives who once prepared to bring Europe to its knees. To NATO governments, the possibility, however small, that unidentified Soviet operatives or hidden caches still existed created a persistent, low-level anxiety. Intelligence agencies quietly launched several long-term investigations searching for evidence of abandoned cells. Some involved tracking individuals whose paper trails began abruptly in the 1960s or 1970s. Others involved combing through property records for signs of Soviet-era safe houses purchased under shell companies. In several cases, investigators found properties in Germany, Belgium, and Austria that had been rented for years by occupants who disappeared suddenly around the time of the USSR's collapse, leaving behind nothing but empty rooms and faint traces of chemical explosives on the floorboards. The operatives themselves, trained since youth to disappear into society, were perfectly equipped to vanish once their missions became obsolete. What haunted intelligence agencies the most was the possibility that some of these former operatives might still possess weapons, explosives, or specialized knowledge that could be dangerous in the wrong hands. Without Moscow's control, their ideological certainty might erode, leaving them vulnerable to exploitation by extremist groups, criminal organizations, or hostile foreign powers. But despite decades of speculation, no definitive proof ever surfaced that any rogue suicide brigade member had gone active after 1991. Perhaps they were too loyal to betray their training. Perhaps they no longer believed in the cause. Or perhaps they simply grew old and tired, longing only for quiet lives in the countries they once prepared to tear apart. Meanwhile, in Russia itself, the story of these operatives became a whispered legend within military circles, a reminder of a time when the USSR prepared for a war so catastrophic that human lives were seen as expendable components of a vast and merciless strategy. High-ranking officers who served during the Cold War occasionally referenced those who never returned, speaking of the suicide operatives with a mixture of respect and sorrow. They were ghosts, one retired colonel said, trained to die without hesitation, trained to live without being seen. They died for nothing, and yet they were ready to die for everything. Their legacy also influenced the next generation of Russian Special Forces doctrine. While modern units are not suicidal in design, the idea of embedding operatives abroad for long-term infiltration lives on in hybrid warfare strategies, cyber infiltration, and intelligence operations in Europe and the United States. Analysts believe that Russia's modern, illegal intelligence operatives, deep cover spies placed abroad for years, are the ideological descendants of the suicide brigades, though with missions that emphasize information rather than destruction. The moral questions surrounding the suicide brigades remain profound. What does it mean for a state to create soldiers who are never meant to return? What psychological scars were carved into the men trained to erase their own identities? How many lived and died without ever being recognized as heroes, villains, or victims? Their story exposes the darkest reality of totalitarian military strategy, the willingness of a government to turn human beings into disposable instruments. These operatives were not volunteers seeking glory. They were conscripts molded into shadows, conditioned to believe that dying alone behind enemy lines was the highest form of patriotism. And yet, beneath the ideology and conditioning, they were still human. Many had families they were forbidden to contact, memories they were forbidden to revisit, dreams they were forbidden to have. They lived their entire lives inside a contradiction, existing publicly as ordinary men while privately knowing that their deaths were already planned. Decades later, historians studying the Cold War recognize the suicide brigades as one of the most extreme manifestations of Soviet paranoia, a military creation designed to compensate for technological inferiority through human sacrifice. It was a doctrine born from fear, sustained by secrecy, and executed through the systematic dehumanization of its own soldiers. As Europe rebuilt and modernized after the Cold War, few citizens realized how close their cities came to becoming battlegrounds for these silent operatives. Bridges they drove across daily were once marked for demolition. Train stations they hurried through on their way to work appeared in diagrams labeled high civilian impact potential. Quiet neighborhoods in West Germany contain safe houses stocked with explosives placed there by men who never intended to see another sunrise after the first day of war. And yet, because the Cold War never erupted into open conflict, the world these operatives trained for never materialized. Their missions, meticulously planned for decades, dissolved into irrelevance. Their purpose quietly expired. But their story endures as a chilling reminder of the hidden human cost of geopolitical rivalry. Beneath diplomacy, beneath the détente, beneath the iron speeches and nuclear treaties, there existed a hidden war. A war of shadows, secrets, and sacrifice. A war fought not on open battlefields, but in the minds of men conditioned to die. Today, their legacy lingers like smoke. In dusty archives, in mysterious abandoned caches, in the faint echoes of coded radio transmissions long since fallen silent. Somewhere, an elderly man in a European village may still remember a past he can never speak of. Somewhere, a buried container of Soviet explosives may still lie beneath a forest floor. Somewhere, a forgotten name in an erased file may belong to a soldier whose entire life was an untriggered weapon. The Soviet suicide brigades stand as a stark testament to the darkest extremes of Cold War strategy. Proof that when nations fear annihilation, they may create forces that embody annihilation itself. Their story is not one of victory or defeat, but of sacrifice without purpose, loyalty without recognition, and a silence that stretches from the Iron Curtain into the modern day. In the end, they were soldiers trained to be invisible, and so they vanished. But the shadow they cast on history remains, a warning of what states will do when survival becomes an obsession, and when human life becomes a tool rather than a treasure.